the AI6 podcast with Joanne Sweeney.
Michael O'Kane here. It's my absolute pleasure, as always, on a Thursday morning to be joined by Joanne Sweeney of the Digital Training Institute. How are you doing this morning, Joanne?
Very good. Great to be back with you.
The pleasure is mine. Joanne, before we kick off with this week's conversation, I quickly want to follow up on last week's conversation. Of course, for anybody who missed it, we had the conversation about the University of Galway's recent report about social media and social media's impact on teenagers in this country. Now, the reason I want to follow up with that is because, of course, the UK have announced a social media ban for under 16s. Keir Starmer had a press conference earlier this week talking about his impressions on the ban. So, Joanne, I suppose just to kick off the conversation then, what were your initial impressions when the announcement came out about this ban for under 16s in the UK?
Well, it's pretty brave, I would say, of Sir Keir Starmer to bring in the ban for under 16s, and so they won't have access to social media. Well, obviously we need the big social media companies to do it, but he's called on the EU to follow suit. And many people are saying, how is this going to be implemented? Obviously, legally, the social networks will have to comply, but also, you know, young people have been discussing it. I saw them being interviewed on shows like BBC News, and, you know, people have mixed feelings. Young people say that, you know, the social networks have an obligation to protect them against content that they shouldn't see, and they've called for greater moderation. But I think it's potentially going to put the EU under pressure on this, with the UK being so bold on.
Yeah, and with the UK taking action kind of so abruptly, let's say, what impact do you think that's going to have on the conversation in Ireland? Because I think Ireland, is fair to say, we're kind of waiting to see what the EU kind of decides when it comes to this issue. What impact do you think issue putting in place this ban is going to have on Ireland?
Well, we take over the presidency of the Council of the European Union in literally 2 weeks, and we know that digital is one of the priorities of the Irish government in terms of shaping the EU agenda. I think it's going to be a big conversation, and I think it's going to put legislators under real pressure to potentially follow suit, because for years they've been talking about the dangers of social media and how algorithms are designed to be addictive. But maybe they should consult with young people on what they think, although because they're under 16, they don't have a vote, they don't have a say, but their parents do, and many parents might be in favour of it.
Yeah, it'll certainly be interesting to see. I'm sure it'll be a conversation that myself and you will also be keeping tabs on here on our digital download. And it kind of segues us perfectly into the conversation for today, right? The idea of governments becoming more willing to regulate digital platforms, in particular AI. And that brings us on to this week's story, a big AI story, we should say. And actually something I was talking to you over text message. I'd never personally heard of Fable 5 before. To me, it was a video game title, but I suppose you want to inform listeners exactly what this story is involving Anthropic and Fable 5 this week.
So Anthropic is the company that has the AI model called Claude, that some of your listeners might be familiar with. And about a month ago, it was revealed that Mythos, a new model developed by Claude, was one of the most powerful models ever released. So powerful, in fact, that it identified glitches on the internet that had never been identified. And so powerful that Claude itself says, we are not going to release this because it's too powerful and we think it potentially could be dangerous. Now, you could say that it released the baby sister or baby brother of Mythos 5 with the release of Fable 5. And I actually was using it late last week before it was disabled.
Really?
But I was using it for kind of business forecasting, business planning, a few things that I've got in the pipeline. So I was helping it work on strategy with me, and have to say, very much enjoying it. But then I'm in a WhatsApp group with other AI builders, and somebody said, hey, has anyone noticed Fable 5 is gone? I went to check and I saw that it had also been disabled on my side. And basically, the US government, citing national security authorities, issued what they call an export control directive, and it mandated Anthropic to suspend all access to Fable 5 and to Mythos 5 by what they call any foreign national, whether inside or outside of the United States. So that was their particular directive. Now, of course, Anthropic, wanting and probably needing to comply as a US registered company, couldn't actually switch it off for just non-US users. And in fact, it decided to just turn it off for everyone. So I guess the story here is government intervention in AI frontier models.
For any listeners who are just hearing this story for the first time here, Joanne, as I said, I wasn't familiar myself with Fable 5 until you kind of brought this to my attention. Why is the decision creating waves across Europe, and why should we as the public be paying attention?
Well, a couple of things here, and I've had conversations even with clients of mine in the last week. Number one, oh my goodness, what if we become so reliant on these handful of US models and then they're taken away from us, because people are already building with the likes of Claude, and we're building with Fable and converting them into workforces and agents within their machines and their workflows. Secondly, what does this say about government? Well, you could call it interfering or interjecting when it comes to the world of AI and business, because we know that regulation is often slower than innovation, and certainly when it comes to AI. And this happened very, very quickly and out of the blue, and Anthropic called it a misunderstanding. So they don't totally agree that there are security issues. And then thirdly, I think the third discussion is, should we be building our own sovereign models, which is countries building their own AI models, the likes of Claude, and then businesses, should we be building our own AI models? But the counter argument to that is it's a very expensive thing to do.
I want to touch on that point a little bit more. As you mentioned there, it's more than just Anthropic, so to speak, because it is the wider conversation about Europe, but let's even just point it directly at Ireland, our reliance on these foreign AI bots. I was reading a thing there from Al Carnes, the British MP, about how hospitals and different companies were already in the process of using Fable 5 when it suddenly shut down. So what's the immediate effect as it applies to Ireland and our use of, in this case, Anthropic's AI, and anything that's looking forward to kind of redeem that?
Well, I mean, what I would say in Ireland, we are certainly using these models. The US models, that's for sure. The figures show that by and large, ChatGPT, Claude, Copilot for Microsoft, these, and Gemini from Google, these are the models that we are reliant on now in our businesses. Secondly, are people building their own? There are absolutely people building their own models. And actually, the Irish government right now has a market consultation ongoing where it's asking Irish companies, what are you building that you could provide as potential solutions to us? And I think that's going to move that conversation in a completely different direction and saying, should we be building Irish-owned models? But remember, many of the models that we might build might have an underbelly and an underlayer of one of those US models. And the EU actually has a new piece of legislation coming on stream. It's the Cloud and the Sovereignty Act. And that is looking to Europe to not just getting us to use more AI models that are built and designed within the EU, but also our tech systems, because beyond AI, we're using systems, like Teams and Zoom and our email and our SharePoint that are US owned. So there's definitely a bigger conversation happening.
I mean, it's a very direct question, Joanne, but is there even currently a European alternative to these US AI companies?
Yes, there's a French large language model called Mistral, and it's Le Chat. And that is French, as I said, and that's free for anyone to go and use and set up an account right now. And I know many of my clients in EU institutions are moving to that and encouraging their staff to use it. But it's very hard to get people to change their behavior. ChatGPT was first out of the gates. There are like 1 billion users right now. Claude was positioned itself as the enterprise model, and Copilot with all its Microsoft clients just could not convert. So it's going to be very difficult to get people to change their behavior. But that's where the regulators might step in and say, we are enforcing potentially, especially in the government field, they can say what models they use and what models their staff use. But people speak with their purse and with their actions. And right now, the US models are commanding our attention and also our money.
It's interesting, isn't it? Like this whole situation with Anthropic specifically, because that's obviously the news story of the week. It's been described as a wake-up call for Europe, European businesses, companies out there on how reliant we are on foreign tech, whether it's AI, whether it's things like Microsoft. There's been a heavy conversation about how much European companies and European governments are relying on these foreign technologies. And I suppose my question is, what are the kind of lessons that governments, businesses, companies should learn from this wake-up call?
I think there's a number of lessons. Number one, that business is absolutely influenced by geopolitical situations right now. The world is very small. If a ripple happens at the other side of the world, it reaches here across the Atlantic into Ireland. The other lesson is that we need a conversation around sovereign AI, and is that our future? Will the EU or independent nation states build their own? And then thirdly, how do we get consumers to change behavior if that is actually going to be an obligation? And then fourthly, regulation needs to keep up. I mean, already the argument is the AGI is already here, artificial general intelligence, where the bots are more or clever than the humans. So we really need to accelerate our understanding and where we want to go. So putting AI conversations on every agenda and meetings in government, in your own workplace, I think is very important, because we should all have a say, right? We don't want to leave it into the hands of a few people, and certainly not just simply in the hands of lawmakers either. I think we all need to have a say on what the world looks like with AI running it in tandem with humans.
Just to close this piece then, Joanne, and thank you so much as always for joining us here for the Thursday Digital Download. For the listeners and kind of ourselves, like the smaller parties who are involved in this and they're affected by something like this being disabled by the US, what's one of the takeaways that we should take from the story? What are the things that we should be thinking? What should we be doing when it comes to our personal use of AI?
Well, one thing I would say is certainly continue to adopt and be curious about AI. Whatever model you're using, they're all designed in a very similar way. So the skill set that you have is going to stand to you, but also be mindful of what information that you give these models. Yeah. Because information and data is power, and that can be used. So always just be cognizant of what you put in and where it might go, because it is going into servers and to data centers at the other side of the world.
Joanne Sweeney of the Digital Training Institute, thank you so much as always for joining me here on Good Morning Dublin for our Thursday Digital Download. A huge AI story coming out this week, as well as the story about the social media ban happening over in the UK. Thanks so much for sharing your thoughts with us and the listeners. If the listeners want to learn more about you, connect with you and learn more about the Digital Training Institute, where can they find you, Joanne?
I'm on LinkedIn. Just search for Joanne Sweeney, and also digitaltraining.ie.
Thank you, Joanne. And just to quickly close, because I can already hear some of my colleagues in the office, but also I'm sure many of the listeners thinking right now, sure, look, if you're going to be so worried and so upset about this whole situation with Anthropic, don't be so reliant on AI in the first place. Why even use AI? What's the response to those people who are almost definitely listening in, but more worryingly, I'm more pressing for myself personally, my very colleagues who are definitely looking at me through the glass of the door right now?
You know what? Half of me agrees with them, because it's very difficult to put the genie back in, and, social media is ubiquitous. It's everywhere. And actually, I'm going to propose right now that next week we talk about the 2026 Digital News Report, which came out only this week. And that tells us how people are getting their news and information and the important role that social media plays.
Brilliant stuff. We'll catch up on that very topic this time next week. Thank you so much, Joanne.